Okay. Hey, welcome to History Chats this afternoon. Ooh, yeah. Hey, welcome to History Chats. Right. Distracting myself with my own thing. Yeah. Hey, we're gonna get started in just a couple minutes. Just want to make sure everything is working as always, and to let people get a chance to join here if they would like to watch us live. We are wrapping up a month of lasts. We just concluded in this past about 2 weeks ago our 2-year anniversary. So we've been doing this history chats on a weekly basis. A couple holidays here and there, but for the most part, every week for over 2 years now. And so, yeah, to celebrate the lasts of that, we decided to talk about some lasts. The last, yeah, you get it, yeah. And so that's what we're going to be continuing today. Last one of those programs, and I think it's an interesting one. This is the history of the last. Depending on, I wasn't sure if I should call it the last streetcar, or the last trolley ride. They both kind of fit, and they're both kind of an interesting a thing here. So, yeah. Cool. Making sure that worked. It did. So let me tell you about some stuff coming up. Actually, the big one is that we have our next History Speaks. It's a little sooner. Usually, you have a couple weeks to let you know about this stuff coming up, but coming up not this weekend as I this lot got live here, but the first. Is it the first? I think it's the first weekend. No, it's the second week, so the 8th of October. So the second weekend of October on Saturday. Yeah, so bearing the lead here, Zong, I think is how you pronounce that. Z has very generously agreed to share his story and come here. He is I think local here to Wisconsin. His parents came here from the refugee camps in Thailand after fleeing Laos as part of that Hmong diaspora that brings so many of the people here in the county to this area. But he has seen the difficulty in the transition, and he's going to kind of talk about that, about growing up in this environment, and his desire to dedicate his life to helping people through service and helping his community. It's going to be a great story. That'll be 2 p.m. on Saturday, October 8th. And again, it'll probably be live. I think we might not be live streaming because the internet just isn't reliable necessarily. It's not worth the effort, but we will be recording it. So it will be available a couple days later, perhaps. But yeah, something kind of cool to come up in a little bit. But I think we maybe should just get into the program here. Yeah, take that off. So, last electric streetcar or trolley ride. Okay, just want to make sure my microphone was on. It is great. Yeah, so this is an interesting story. This is a picture that I colorized here. This was not originally a color photograph, but this is a picture of both the last electric streetcar and the very last journey that it took taking passengers in Wausau. This is part of a larger story that we will be getting into, but essentially this event happened on January 10th, 1940. And it's a really interesting one. I believe this is car number 100, which is the first in the fleet. It was originally like a California class when they ordered the trolleys to show up in 1906. Apparently there was a train wreck, and some of the cars that they were going to be sent here were destroyed, and so they just kind of scrambled to get whatever they could secondhand. And this was actually rebuilt. It was originally open sided so that people actually. I don't know why I just didn't put it in the thing. I don't have a picture here. That's right. But yeah, think like the sort of, the California, the sort of San Francisco trolleys, kind of that. And it served for many, many years. And interesting group of people inside it, obviously. You don't see too many high school girls dressed in sort of, I don't know what you call this, regal garb, along with photographers and all sorts of different individuals representing different, the city and companies. And I'm going to get into this. I'm going to explain why this all takes place and how this all came to be. But we probably should. Oh, and also what these people are so excited about, because this is a fun part of the story. This is I think what they call a teaser here. We're going to tease, and then we're going to get into explaining what they're looking at and so excited by. It's a fun picture. But I think first it might be worth just going back and clarifying, because these days trolleys, streetcars, trams, what should we be calling this? What does this actually mean? These are all kind of interchangeable. Technically, at the time, streetcar probably would be the preferred nomenclature. That's what they called it. It's essentially a car from a train, right? Instead of having a bunch of cars together, there's no locomotion, steam-powered engine at the front. This is all contained in one car, and it goes along the street, usually on smaller gauge rails, so it's not quite so heavy as a full trains that we're used to seeing, the railroads. And it's electric powered. Now, different parts of the world, later trolley becomes more used in the United States. Parts of North America, you can still see tram, but tram is, I think, largely used in Europe. But basically, we're talking about the same thing. It's an electric-powered vehicle that goes along streets. It uses a rail to kind of navigate by, and that's kind of what we're looking at. And these become very popular in the early years. And so you can kind of see this. This is another example in front of the trolley barn here in Wausau. This is a trolley. This is actually another one of the replacements. You can see it's early used here. But it's got the tracks that it's going on. It has to follow the tracks. This is a form of transportation that was really developed in larger cities like London and New York, and Chicago eventually kind of filters to some of the larger up-and-coming cities. But it's a way of getting people around. And originally they would have like a car on a track, like mini train, and then they would have horses pull it like a carriage. And then what's the electric motor, which you can see these wires here. There is a system that was established early on. They were, over the course of the late 1800s, they were experimenting with other methods. For example, Merrill, Wisconsin, had a really interesting early adoption there. They had a trolley that had an electrified rail, which that got the job done, but it did lead to a bunch of horses and cows or some livestock that ended up getting electrocuted, and then they had to move it, and that's not ideal. So by the time that the Wausau Schofield line goes in, they're using these. So basically, they would have like electric wires that they would be attached to, and then pull the circuits from there, and then it would have an engine in here that would pull it forward. So that's kind of the basics. There's a lot of streetcars. I talked about Merrill very early on, but there's a bunch of them. And I should probably mention here that the history that I'm pulling from here is not exclusively, but largely it's pulled from this book here called, oh, that's right, I mirrored the camera. It's called Badger Traction. It's an amazing book by primarily Joseph Canfield, with a bunch of other people that were helping, and he went out this is published in 1969, and it gives a really good in-depth of the Wisconsin trolley or traction lines that they had. And so these are some of the notable cities. Some of them are interurban, which means that they would go from one city to the other. Some of them were just inside the city. This is not chronological, though, because in fact, Wausau by 1900. I mean, actually, according to the stories, again, Canfield mentions that they had formed a company to try to advocate for a trolley, for streetcars in Wausau in like the mid-1890s. And after about a dozen years, 12 or so years, they finally got through and got a permission in 1905 to form a company to dig up the streets, put in lines, order some cars, and start making service. That comes in 1905. And so over the course of 1906, they get going, and then they have the first streetcars. I talked briefly there about the mishap with the first trolley cars, but as time goes on, excuse me. Once they figure out maybe we don't open sides during the winter, because these would have been all year round, they build them back up and becomes very successful. So here's a postcard of the trolley going along the courthouse 400 block here in Wausau. And it's under the name, and actually this is incorrect. Let me fix that. I just realized. Railroad. It's the Wausau Electric Railroad Company, is the name of the organization. Nope, wait, hold on. Wausau Street Railroad Company, there. Nope, and there's a car there. Wow, I did a great job with this, didn't I? Okay. But yeah, this is the name of the company. The important thing here is that over the course of the experience of running the trolleys here, the name of the company and the company that it owns changed, or that owns it has changed quite a bit. So for example, this gets started in 1905, 1906 as a real company, as opposed to a theoretical one. Maybe it was earlier, I'm not sure. But in 1908, they were getting until 1908, they were getting their electricity to run the trolleys from the electric company, the Wausau Electric Light Company. And in 1909 or 1908, they purchased that company. The same people that own the streetcar company purchased the electric company, and then they put it underneath it. So basically, the streetcar railroad company is a department of a larger organization, and that organization changes. Eventually, it becomes like the Wisconsin Valley Electric Company, and then further down the road in 1933, it merges with the Wisconsin Public Service Corporation. So the names have changed, particularly from like 1900 to 1940. But that's kind of what we're dealing with. It's not super important. Just to clarify, if I refer to the Wisconsin Public Service, that's why this is being called that. But let's talk about the trolley runs itself. Once you get it up and running, people really enjoy it. So it goes, I mean, obviously from downtown here, you can see on 3rd Avenue, or maybe actually, I don't know if this is 3rd Avenue. I think maybe this is going the other way. But anyway, one of the northern spots in 1907, they get permission to build a trolley barn. This is the second iteration, and you can see this. This is actually probably like late 20s, depending on the car models here. But actually, here, let's pull up the map. So this is a map from a Badger Traction. I'm not entirely sure how accurate this is over the course of this. This is representing its height. So it might have gone some other places, but as you can see, it goes down from 3rd Street, and it goes up. This area here would have been the car barn. So that's on DeVoe Avenue? DeVoe Street, I think. No, I'm sorry, DeKalb. It's DeKalb. Yeah, DeKalb Street. Off Bridge Street. So this is Bridge, and then that's where the trolley barn was located. And eventually it gets pushed up to as far as Gilbert Street, because right in here would be the hospital that gets built in, at that point, the St. Mary's. It goes over the west side, over the bridge, down, to the community that's over here and the factories. And then, of course, it goes around downtown and goes down Grand Avenue. And then the left here, you can see it going down. It gets extended over the course of the late 1900s into like 1910. By let's see, I think 1912 is when they extended. Yeah, they extended down from the Rothschild Pavilion and Park, which is right here, which is owned by the electric company, down to the paper mill, which gets built. So I'm just going to go back here. So there's the kind of northern route here. This is it crossing the bridge. This is, Curtis and Yale. Again, getting people to work, and the residential neighborhoods on the west side and the north and the east side, kind of allowing people to get around in a big way. And then, of course, the pavilion becomes a big attraction. People end up taking it down. And I think some of this is the romance here of the trolley. People who grew up with it, remember paying a nickel and getting to go down to Rothschild Pavilion, getting in to see some dancing, going and swimming in the pool, maybe riding the roller coaster that we had. That's for another story here. But then they got to go back, but there was also just a pragmatic necessity here. This allowed people to get to work. This allowed people to get around. Apparently one of the big draws it was the Sunday. I think they called it a service coach or something like that. But basically, before there was, too many Catholic churches, there was really just the one, St. Mary's on Grand Avenue. And all the folks on the west side, all the Catholics, would load up onto the trolley, cross the bridge, and then go to mass. This allowed people to live and access parts of the city that they otherwise would have to walk. And that's kind of the important thing here. The trolleys can really be seen as a replacement for walking around. That's really the goal. Because up until this point, up until trolleys, I mean, one of the reasons that Wausau is so embarrassed that by 1900, we are literally the smallest city in Wisconsin, or sorry, we are the largest city in Wisconsin that doesn't have a trolley system, a streetcar system. And it's not necessarily because we want these bright white, yellow, shiny new toys to have and say, hey, look we have the new stuff. It's really not just about the trolleys, it's about public transportation. Cities are starting to move away from purely being designed, maybe organically or maybe intentionally, excuse me, by being able to walk from place to place. With a public transportation network that has a cheap alternative, you can start to see the development of new communities. Particularly Schofield is a great example of this. We don't have a huge community in Schofield or the southeast side of Wausau, but over the course of the 19-teens, you start to see more additions show up. And, like, for example, the southeast side of Wausau, John Marshall Elementary doesn't get built until like 1922. There's not the same infrastructure that you would have seen had you been on the north side of Wausau, for example, which is maybe more of a traditional area that people were building into. So because of that, normally that would have meant that nobody would have lived there. You would have to have schools and churches and businesses and workplaces. But because people can get a trolley ride, that allows for a much wider distribution of people. Now, of course, we have to talk about the automobile. And in many senses, the automobile is not so much a replacement for walking in the same way that trolleys are. It's a replacement for the horse-drawn carriage, which is to say that people like Frank Boyce here. Frank is the foreman at the Wausau Paper Company up in Brokaw. He does not live in Brokaw. 20 years earlier, this is taken in 1910, before he could have an automobile, he probably wouldn't be living, if he's, actually on the floor overseeing the operations in Brokaw, you'd expect he would live in Brokaw. It's not too far off from Wausau. It's only 4 or 5 miles, depending on where he's coming from. But, he doesn't need to now. He can drive up. The automobile provides a lot of freedom. And for the instance that it's, gets its start in 1905, 1910, I mean, even in 1910, 15, and somewhere, that early teens era, there's even a shortage of automobiles. We haven't ramped up production to make it so that they're super available or even affordable for most homes. So it really was, this in a similar vein to horse-drawn carriages, where not everybody has a carriage of horses that they can just pull out of their, the carriage house and, drive across the city, because then you would have to have somebody watch those horses. And there's all these reasons why that doesn't necessarily make sense getting around within a city. If you were doing that, you were of a class that were able to afford an automobile. But the vast majority, and I'm not just talking about working class guys or families, I'm talking about middle class and even some upper class people that just don't want to get an automobile and drive themselves around. Trolleys make sense. But of course, the automobile does become more popular. And as more and more people are getting involved and they're getting used to the idea of driving around, and as the infrastructure, we have gas stations that show up, garages on houses, we get streets that are paved and parking lots. And, without those things, it would be difficult for the automobile to take off. But it helps, right? We get companies that are churning them out for the masses in large numbers. You get, oil production in refineries to make cheap fuel, to make it feasible for you to afford to drive around. These things, not really something we can take credit for here in central Wisconsin, but they end up, having an impact, right? I want to talk about an individual here. How does this affect the trolleys, right? You might think that this might be in conflict, and I kind of have painted it in that method, but you might have noticed this guy. I didn't really draw attention to him, but this is Nels Rasmussen. Rasmussen? Yeah, Rasmussen. Did I spell that right? Well, that's Nels. He is... Yeah, okay, that's spelled correctly. He is a Danish immigrant. Around 1907, he gets involved driving the streetcars here in Wausau, and he's going to work himself out up the ranks to become superintendent in like the early teens, or assistant superintendent, and then he becomes superintendent in 1919. And he is going to have a lot of, like they called him Nickel Nels because of his insistence not to raise prices to keep fares stable at a nickel, 5 cents. He has a lot of innovative ways that he tries to make this more affordable and make it, something that's going to stick around. Things like, in 1915, he oversaw the switch from trolleys that were 2 people how to operate it to just 1 person taking tickets or the fares and also driving, which removed some of the problems there. Well, in 1923, he was asked by a newspaper, and he gave this statement. He said that the automobile is actually helping our business rather than hurting it, for it is teaching people to ride. If they get into the habit of riding instead of walking, we are not afraid that the streetcars will not get their share of that business. For many times, the automobile is not available, whereas the streetcar always is. And this is an interesting sort of point here. The streetcar is always going around. They plowed the streets. Before Wausau, the city, or any like villages or cities in the area were removing snow, the trolley system did that because they kept running during the winter. So during the winter, for example, your cars, and if we go back to like these kind of cars, you probably have to winterize them. You couldn't just leave like the oil and all of the machinery there for the get freezing. We've come a long way from this. So you probably wouldn't want to drive in the winter. And even after cars get a little bit more reliable, like it's dangerous. And beyond that, there's also this question of like, who can afford it, right? Let's say you're sort of a middle class, you're Nels, let's, go back to Frank Boyce for a second, he has a car. Great. So come Monday morning when he goes up to Brokaw to oversee the factory, the paper factory, he's gone, but his wife now does not have a car to call upon. His kids aren't driving their own cars to high school or what have you, right? So not everybody can afford it. Even if you're a family that can afford a car, it's going to be a while before we have multiple cars in a family. And so the trolley provides that operation. So they don't see it as a problem. In fact, we start to see some changes to adopt this. Some of the downsides of the trolleys are the infrastructure you need, right? So in Merrill, interestingly, like in 1912, they are the first city in Wisconsin to have trackless trolleys. Here he goes. So this is them looking into it, but in 1912, they will establish this, partially as a way of expanding routes to fit, the widening, expanding of the city, without having to put down tracks. So this still uses electric motor. This is a trolley bus, is what they called it. It still pulls the electricity from the line to power the engine, but it has these rubber tires that allow them to get around. And eventually, we're going to see the rise of gasoline-powered engines in buses. So how does this affect things? Well, it's interesting. 1925 is kind of a big year. 1925, in May, Wausau starts to establish bus service. Now, the bus services are mostly for areas that they couldn't expand into. Looking at the northwest side in particular, like they didn't, if we went back to this map here, if you live up here in these new communities on the west side here, it's going to be a bit of a walk to get to the trolley. And they want to be able to serve that population, but it's expensive to rip up the streets and put in the rails and the infrastructure. And so using a gasoline-powered bus to kind of bridge the gap, that's a nice way to do that. That same year, there was a convention here in Wausau, and notably Lucius Storrs of New York, who's the director of the American Electric Railway Association, gives a very flamboyant statement saying streetcars won't be run out. And part of the discussion here is we're working to make it more efficient and make the technology better, but also, as he says here, electric railways that do not operate bus lines are behind the times. Buses are going to be part of the toolkit that you're going to need to survive. And you can see also in 1925, the Wisconsin Valley Electric Company, which is the owner at this point, they're trying to train people to understand, hey, there's some problems here, right? They say, look before, for auto drivers, they ought to look before they start from the curb and do not drive into streetcar tracks without looking to see that is no danger from approaching streetcars. Streetcars cannot turn out. Autos can. In the interest of safety to yourself and others, please give streetcars the right of way. Do not pass a streetcar while passengers are getting off or on or off. You may kill someone. Better safe than sorry. And this kind of gets to the idea. As more people are driving around in automobiles, the streets get a little hectic. There's more traffic, there's more congestion, and the streetcars, which have to go down the center of the rail, like they have to go with the rails, which is down the center of the street, creates a bit of a problem. And there's safety concerns, right? On an automobile, you can just turn the wheel and swerve out of the way to hit somebody, but streetcars can't do that. In fact, again, you see articles like this in the Daily Herald. I think this is Daily Herald, saying, would you suppose a streetcar is safer? Well, a streetcar is not safer than a bus. It's actually the opposite because of these reasons, right? And so I think partially this is a way of saying, don't worry, streetcars are good, but buses are good too. But ultimately, this is going to be causing a problem. Again, look at this. This is a picture from the 1930s. Streetcars are kind of just part of the traffic. And by this point, excuse me. By this point, automobiles have gotten better and quicker, and streetcars are slow, they're rambling, they're loud and noisy. They create electromagnetic interference. I think one of my favorite stories is anecdotes about how people that lived along the trolley line could tell when a trolley would pass because their radios would go staticky because of the electromagnetic energy that was, interference that was coming off of the motors. So there's some reasons that maybe these aren't the best. Now, we could have then pivoted to developing more efficient streetcars. It made sense in larger cities to do this, but here in many of the smaller cities, the writing's kind of on the wall. Over the course of the 1920s, people had pivoted. For example, up in Merrill, by the early 20s, they had moved to gasoline-powered buses as opposed to streetcars. Many other communities were doing the same. And in 1937, by this point, Niels Rasmussen has kind of made peace with this as being like, yeah, we're going to have to probably do this. And here in 1939, they schedule a hearing which to abandon the streetcar service. And ultimately, this is successful, leading to this interesting titled thing saying that this article from like the following day saying trolleys lose race against progress. Motor buses win. This isn't against the concept of public transportation. This is against the kind of transportation that we're using. Motor buses seem like the future. Streetcars, and the article is a little less judgmental. They're more of like, back in the day, streetcars were great. They were amazing. They changed our lives. But are they really what we need to do in the future? And so the decision was made then in January of 1940. The following year, in a few months after this, rather than quietly phase them out as many other cities had done, they decided to have a big send-off. They switched out all the trolleys for a new fleet of buses at the exact same time at, I think it might have been midnight. I don't know if they did midnight here. I know in Green Bay they had like a changing of the guard, so to speak. But to celebrate this, the week presiding the switch, Wisconsin Public Service announced that the entire week, free fares. You could ride the trolley as much as you want for free, or you could get our new buses and experience that fun thing. And we're going to announce a ceremony. And at that ceremony, we're going to have a bunch of stuff happen, and this is where we get back to these guys and what they're so excited about. There's a bit of at the end of that last day on January 10th, I think like the statistic was like 24,000 people rode the buses on that single day, buses and the trolleys, which is kind of crazy. But these people are actually witnessing something as part of the ceremony here, which has to do with this picture here. So this being the United States in the 1930s, effectively, pageants were great. So they had a pageant. The local high school ran a competition, and a queen of transportation named Norma Schmidt was crowned. And she had the honor and the duty to usher in a new era. And so after everybody had gotten a chance, I think like at 8:30, 9 o'clock, they had some speeches. and she gives the speech. And I'm gonna read out what she says here because it's very interesting. This is according to the Daily Herald and their accounts of it. So they have a representative bus, a new auto bus there, and they have car 100, the first and now going to be the last trolley. She turns to the trolley and she declares, "To you, who have served the humble and exalted of Wausau and its neighbor city so well during the past third of a century. To you who through snow and ice, through rain and wind, through sunshine and darkness have traveled our streets faithful to your appointed task of public conveyor. To you, the last streetcar, we respectfully offer this final discharge. Honored, respected, your task is finished, your final rest earned. We acknowledge you as the last streetcar." Capital LSC, last streetcar. Then she turned to the bus. And the bus, she says to the chosen bus for the dedication, "To you, hopeful successor to an illustrious past, expectant heir to the riding goodwill of our community, we dedicate the wind and the storm, the sleet, the snow, the rain, the blizzard, the traffic tie-ups, the trials and troubles of public transportation during the many years to come. To you, too, we dedicate the care of children going to and from school, the task of bringing our workers to shop, store, and office on time and taking them home again to their families, the guidance of shoppers, the visitors, the infants, the old and the feeble. May you do this important work well and faithfully. May you bring to your new task the same devotion of man and equipment that your proud parent here, the last streetcar, spent on his task." And then she grabbed a bottle of milk, broke it over the hubcap of the bus, and declared, "I now christen thee, who aspire to such high purpose, the public service coach." So there's a very Wisconsin way to usher in a new form of public transportation. Let's break a bottle of milk over the hubcap. So that's what they're excited about. Again, this is a fun one to colorize. Yeah. So and there we go. Starting the next day, by the way, sometimes I see people that have come across a commemorative coin from 1940. If you rode the bus in the following week after the changeover, you were given a coin as a commemorative until they ran out. I'm assuming, a publicity, a souvenir of the moment. And yeah. And then, of course, after this is all done, after the speeches are over, Norma and her court, the reporters, the Nels Rasmussen, and dignitaries from the Wisconsin Public Service Corporation, the mayor, city officials, they got on the trolley one more time. They brought out of retirement the two gentlemen who actually ran. That was Martin Christensen, who was then living in Green Bay, retired, and the conductor was J.C. Justinson, who was living in Mosinee. So they brought them back. They were the two people that originally ran the first trolley back in 1907. So it's a cyclical thing. And then they rode the trolley one last time. And after that point, the trolleys were no longer in service in this area, in Wausau and Schofield. Now, of course, Wisconsin Public Service continued to run the bus system, and then it passed through a variety of hands. At some point, I want to get back to that story because that's a fascinating story, but obviously running out of time here today. Yeah, I can leave it there. Thanks for listening. I'm just going to jump over. Before I check, and this is your chance, if you have any questions or comments, I'm going to check in a second. But just to let you know, we are done with our lasts. This is the last of September, sorry. And in October, we're going to the stories. There we go. Gotta get my. We're going to look at the stories from the archives. So myself, Gary, Martina, the archival staff here, as well as one of our interns, Brenna, who has been working on digitizing some things. We're each going to showcase an interesting collection. What's inside these boxes? If you've ever seen inside an archives, just shelves full of boxes. Well, there's interesting stuff. There's interesting stories, and so we are going to take a month and just spotlight some interesting stories from the collections in our archives. So that's what we're going to be doing in October. Okay, I'm just going to check to see any questions. What's going on? Okay, that's weird. Anyway, it's fine. Yeah. I'm guessing Scott has was trying San Francisco. That's the city that I was struggling to remember. Um, but yeah, and then also mentioned the movement to get rid of the streetcars to sell buses. The bus makers undersold their buses. Once the streetcars were gone, prices went up. Yeah, that's definitely true. I think that there is, if there is a there's a conspiracy out there about whether the automobile industry, the bus manufacturers, were working behind the scenes or maybe legally to try and undercut the bus or the trolley service and make it so that people went with buses. I didn't want to go that tinfoil hattie, but there's definitely I think there's probably some justification to those sort of ideas in some sense. But it also, that's the way things were going. I don't know if the streetcars, given their limitation of having to have the infrastructure, really could even meet what we need, the buses to do today. And what we do for the buses is realistically speaking, we can't do as much as we did back in the 19 teens to reach all of the population of the city. So it's kind of an interesting thing. But again, I didn't want to get too deep into all of that. For the sake of telling an interesting story, I guess. So there we go. Yeah, like I said, there's some fun stuff coming up. Got the stories from the archives next week, as well as I'll just put back up the History Speaks coming up, not this weekend, but next weekend, which will be a great one too. So we hope you come back and join us for all of that. And in the meantime, I think we'll maybe call it. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.